Hi, Steve here, blessedhopeforever.com. I want to go back in time a little ways, roughly just a little over 400 years. I think about 405 to be exact, all the way back to the arrival of the Mayflower and the Puritans who came over on the Mayflower. The Puritans, with their deep theological convictions and their fervent piety, they wrote a lot about heaven. Their descriptions emphasized not only its glory, but more importantly, the presence of God in Christ as a supreme joy. I want to read you some of the quotes from these Puritan writings. Richard Baxter, 1615, he said that the perfect, endless enjoyment of God by the perfected saints. That was how he described heaven. In our first paradise in Eden, there was a way to go out, but no way to go in again. But as for the heavenly paradise, there's a way to go in, but no way to go out. He also said that the ultimate bliss of heaven lay in the direct, unhindered communion with God. Another Puritan wrote that heaven is not heaven without Christ. The joys of heaven are not the joys of heaven without Christ. He's the very heaven of heaven. There are many wonderful quotes in all of these Puritan writings. I first got a hold of a book back in the late 80s and was reading through this and their descriptions of heaven, and they were really quite remarkable. Their focus was definitely in the right place. Thomas Watson was another one. He lived 1620 to 1686. This would be the Mayflower time frame. He wrote, "Let this revive you. Shortly you will enjoy God, and then you shall have more than you can ask or think. Glory without intermission or expiration. We will never be ourselves fully until we enjoy God eternally. Christ is the most bountiful physician. Other patients do enrich their physicians, but here the physician enriches the patient. Christ elevates all his patients. He not only cures them, but crowns them." Revelation 2, verse 10. Christ not only raises them from the bed, but to the throne. He gives the sick man not only health, but also heaven. And heaven will make amends for all. Samuel Rutherford, who lived during the same time period, said heaven and Christ are the same thing. He said that if I could be in heaven without Christ, it would be a hell, and if I could be in hell and have Christ still, it would be a heaven to me, for he's all the heaven that I want. So the Puritans' constant emphasis was on Christ as the central joy of heaven. They wrote that he doesn't just promise us great and glorious things to be created by him, but he himself will be our heaven. These were good and godly men, Puritans, as they call them. Maybe you know something about the Puritans, maybe you don't. I've done videos on this in the past. I've done several videos. It's been years ago. But this has always been a favorite topic of mine. Probably because I'm a Christian and I live in America and I like history. And given who they were and why they came here, and especially what happened after they came here, and where that has brought us to today. So these quotes demonstrate the Puritan conviction that heaven's glory is not merely a place of rest from earthly toils, but primarily a state of perfect communion with God in Christ, where all the desires of the soul are fully satisfied in his presence. Puritans were Reformed. They were Calvinists. The Puritans were deeply rooted in the Reformed tradition and were without doubt Calvinists in their theology. That is who founded this country. Puritanism was a reform movement within the Church of England in the 16th and the 17th centuries. Their aim was to purify the church of what they saw as lingering Roman Catholic practices and to bring it into fuller conformity with the principles of the Protestant Reformation, particularly those developed in continental Europe by figures like John Calvin. So the Reformed label broadly encompasses those Protestant churches and theological systems that emerged from this particular stream of the Reformation. The Puritans were staunch adherents to Calvinist theology. This means that they embraced core doctrines articulated by John Calvin. Now, if you're a Calvinist, you love that. If you're an Arminian, well, maybe not so much so. They believed in a strong belief. They had a strong belief in God's absolute sovereign control over all things, total depravity. They believed in total depravity. They believed in unconditional election. They believed in limited atonement or particular redemption. The belief that Christ's atoning work on the cross was specifically for the elect. They believed in irresistible grace, the idea that God's saving grace can't be resisted by those that He has chosen. And they believed in the perseverance of the saints, the assurance that those truly saved by God will endure in faith to the end. This is what they believed. Many of you are familiar with the famous TULIP acronym: total depravity, unconditional election, limited atonement, irresistible grace, and perseverance of the saints. That acronym was formulated later. But the theological concepts that it represents were central to Puritan thought. A hallmark of Puritan theology, closely linked to Calvinism, was covenant theology. This was a framework that was understood as God's relationship with humanity through a series of covenants. For example, the covenant of works with Adam, the covenant of grace through Christ. This was a major theological development by Puritan theologians themselves, building on earlier Reformed thought. Now, it's important to note that while they shared a common Calvinistic theology, Puritans had diversity in their views on church governance. Some favored a Presbyterian type system, others a Congregationalist type system, and some remained within the Episcopal structure of the Church of England, though they sought to reform it from within. Despite these internal variations, their theological bedrock was consistently Reformed and Calvinistic. And as I've stated in previous videos, the Pilgrims were Puritans. They were a specific group within the broader Puritan movement, but with a crucial distinction. They were separatists. Separatists. Puritans in general was a broad movement in England during the 16th and 17th centuries. Their core belief was that the Church of England, while Protestant, still retained too many popish Roman Catholic practices, and it needed to be purified. They aimed to reform the Church of England from within, and they were Calvinists in their theology. Pilgrims, on the other hand, were separatists. The Pilgrims were a radical faction of Puritans who believed that the Church of England was beyond repair. It was beyond reform. They felt that it was so corrupt that true believers needed to separate from it entirely and form their own independent congregations. and that the act of separation was illegal in England, and it led to their persecution. So you don't misunderstand, while all pilgrims were Puritans in their general theological outlook, Calvinism, not all Puritans were pilgrims. The key difference lay in their approach to the Church of England. Puritans, the non-separating ones, they sought to purify the Church of England from within. The larger group who settled the Massachusetts Bay Colony were primarily non-separating Puritans. Now, Pilgrims, on the other hand, they were separatists. They believed that the Church of England was irredeemably corrupt, and they chose to completely separate from it. And this group founded Plymouth Colony in 1620. So, in essence, the Pilgrims were a more extreme wing of the Puritan movement, driven by their conviction that true worship could only happen outside the established Church of England. And both groups settled in America. The Massachusetts Bay Colony and the Plymouth Colony, both. Both the Puritan Calvinist separatist Pilgrims, as well as the Puritan Calvinist non-separatists, that is, the larger non-separating groups, settled in America, forming distinct but eventually intertwined colonies in what is now Massachusetts. The Pilgrims, as you know, Plymouth Colony, 1620, was the smaller group of separatist Puritans seeking complete freedom to practice their religion outside the Church of England. They first went to Holland, and then they famously sailed on the Mayflower to establish Plymouth Colony in 1620. They were the first permanent English settlement in New England. The Puritans of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, 10 years later, 1630, about a decade later, they followed with a much larger wave of Puritans who still hoped to reform the Church of England, but faced increasing persecution under King Charles I. They embarked on what is known as the Great Migration. They established the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1630 with its main settlement at Boston. And this was a significantly larger, better funded undertaking than Plymouth. But there were major differences in their settlements. Massachusetts Bay Colony was much larger and wealthier right from its inception, bringing over thousands of settlers and more resources. Plymouth, however, remained a smaller, more humble colony. Now, while both of them sought religious freedom, the Pilgrims aimed to create a completely new religious community separate from the old. Whereas the Massachusetts Bay Puritans aimed to establish a city upon a hill, a model society for the rest of the world, including England, to emulate, the Massachusetts Bay Colony had an official charter from the king, giving it more formal legitimacy from the English perspective. Plymouth, on the other hand, established its own foundational document. You may have heard of it. That's the Mayflower Compact, as a form of self-governance. And over time, the Massachusetts Bay Colony became the dominant power in the region. And eventually, in 1691, Plymouth Colony was absorbed into the larger province of Massachusetts Bay, effectively merging the two Puritan-founded groups. So, while they had different origins and initial approaches to religious reform, both groups played a foundational role in the early colonization of New England, and they left a significant legacy on American culture and identity, which affected you and I in ways that we can barely imagine. the distance between the two colonies, Plymouth Colony and Massachusetts Bay Colony, is roughly 60 miles. It's an approximation. You know, I used the locations of Plymouth Rock in Plymouth, Mass, and the Massachusetts Bay Colony founding landmark in Massachusetts. I can't remember the place to estimate the distance. And these are representative locations within the original colony areas. Now imagine what would have happened if the larger province of Massachusetts Bay had been absorbed into the tiny little Plymouth colony. Well, of course, that wasn't going to happen, but I'll let you think about that for a moment. So the purity of the separatist pilgrims remained pure. However, it didn't become mainstream Christian America. And that touches upon a complex and often debated aspect of American history. Even the purity of the pilgrims, and the Puritans generally, wasn't entirely sustained or easily maintained, and their ideals faced significant challenges over time. Even within their own ranks, there were disagreements about doctrine, practice, and the extent of reform. There were figures who, like Roger Williams, who advocated for religious freedom and founded Rhode Island. And then there was Anne Hutchinson, who challenged the established religious authority, who was expelled from, they both were expelled, both of them were expelled from Massachusetts Bay, demonstrating that even those seeking purity couldn't maintain complete theological or social uniformity. The initial enthusiasm and intense reverence of the first generation of settlers just declined over subsequent generations. Concerns arose about a decline in religious fervor among the children and the grandchildren, leading to practices like what they called the halfway covenant, allowing descendants of church members to be baptized even if they hadn't had a conversion experience. All that in an effort to attempt to maintain church membership. The practicalities of building a new society, farming, trade, defense, sometimes overshadowed purely spiritual pursuits. The pursuit of economic prosperity, while initially seen as a sign of God's blessing, became a distraction from religious devotion. The ideals of purity and Christian charity often clashed with the realities of colonial expansion in conflict with the Native Americans, the indigenous populations. And ironically, those who sought religious freedom for themselves often became intolerant of others who held different beliefs. For example, the Quakers and the Baptists. And this demonstrated a limitation in their own vision of a pure society, which for them meant a society based on their specific interpretation of God's Word and God's will. And over generations, as New England developed, a slow but steady process of secularization occurred. And while religion remained important, the direct governance by religious leaders and the absolute dominance of religious law gradually lessened, particularly as mercantile interests grew and broader Enlightenment ideas began to influence the colonies. So while the Pilgrims and the Puritans began with a powerful drive for religious purity and the establishment of a godly society, the complexities of human nature, the reality of the fallen nature, the challenges of a new environment, the internal disagreements, and all the external pressures meant that their ideal of purity was constantly tested, adapted, and ultimately transformed. This journey from an ideal vision to a more complex reality is a fascinating aspect of their legacy. So to get this straight, again, so you don't misunderstand, Pilgrims were a specific group of separatists who sailed on the Mayflower and they founded Plymouth Colony. Puritans, the name Puritans is a broader term for a religious reform movement. Some Puritans were separatists like the Pilgrims, but the majority of Puritans who came here to the Massachusetts Bay Colony were non-separating Puritans. All Pilgrims were Puritans in their theology, but not all Puritans were Pilgrims. The distinguishing factor was whether they believed in separating from the Church of England or reforming it from within. The non-separating Puritans who founded the Massachusetts Bay Colony were a much larger group. They did not consider themselves pilgrims. The term pilgrim specifically refers to the passengers of the Mayflower and their initial community, the initial settlement at Plymouth. The Pilgrims were the most famous group of separatist Puritans, and non-separatists were not Pilgrims. The Pilgrims were separatists. The non-separatists were Puritans, but they were not Pilgrims. Okay, they were the larger group who founded the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Again, both were Puritans, but only the separatists were Pilgrims. Okay, the term Pilgrims specifically refers to that particular group of separatists who came over on the Mayflower and founded Plymouth Colony. And both groups were Calvinists. Both the separatists, Pilgrims, and the non-separating Puritans were Calvinists. Calvinism was the dominant theological framework for nearly all Puritans, regardless of whether they chose to separate from the Church of England or worked for reform from within. Their understanding of God's sovereignty, human sinfulness, predestination, and the nature of salvation was deeply rooted in the teachings of John Calvin and his theological successors. So what about Arminianism? Since the dominating Christian belief system today is Arminian. Well, it's important to note that Arminianism did exist in England, and it was a growing and increasingly controversial force during the time that the Puritans were active and immigrating to America in the 16th, mid-17th centuries. Arminianism originated with Jacobus Arminius, born in 1560. He was a Dutch Reformed theologian. His ideas, which challenged aspects of strict Calvinist predestination, began to gain traction in the Netherlands in the early 17th century. And in 1618, 1619, an international Reformed court with English delegates present was called to address Arminianism, and it officially condemned Arminian views and it affirmed the 5 points of Calvinism. 1618, that was 407 years ago. But despite its condemnation in the Netherlands, Arminianism found fertile ground in England, particularly under the reign of King James I, and more so King Charles I. Now, by the 1620s and 1630s, Arminianism became increasingly prominent within the Church of England, especially among the high church faction favored by King Charles I. And this was in direct opposition to the Puritan desire for a simpler, more purified church and Presbyterian governance or congregational church governance. Now, what I find most interesting is the rise of of Arminianism in England was a major factor contributing to the Puritans' desire to leave. The Puritans saw Arminianism not just as a theological error, but as a dangerous shift away from true Protestantism, bordering on Catholicism and threatening their very understanding of salvation in God's grace. They believed that it undermined the doctrines that had been central to the English Reformation. Arminianism was very much present and a significant theological and political opponent of the Puritans in England during the period of their immigration. And that makes it more interesting because a mainstream Protestant Christianity in the New World, the USA, today is predominantly Arminian in its theology. This is a fascinating and significant point in American religious history. While early American Protestantism, especially in New England, was dominated by Calvinism, a major shift occurred, and today a large portion of mainstream Protestant Christianity in the U.S. is in fact predominantly Arminian in its theology. This shift wasn't sudden, but it evolved over time. There was what they called the Great Awakenings, 18th, 19th centuries. And these two highly influential revival movements played a crucial role. Revivalists like horseback preacher Charles Finney, you've heard me talk about him, emphasized human choice and the anxious bench where individuals were called to make an immediate decision for Christ. This approach leaned towards Arminian errors of free will and conditional salvation, as it made the individual's response central to their conversion experience. In other words, it wasn't about grace at all. Calvinism, with its emphasis on irresistible grace and unconditional election, was seen as less conducive to mass revivalism. And as the United States expanded westward, the frontier spirit fostered a strong sense of individualism and self-reliance. In Arminian theology, which emphasizes individual decision and responsibility in salvation, it resonated more strongly with these folks than the more deterministic aspects of Calvinism. It felt more democratic and empowering to the individual. And over time, American culture became increasingly optimistic about human potential and progress. Arminianism, which suggested a greater degree of human ability to respond to God's grace, fit better with this optimistic outlook than the Calvinist doctrine of total depravity and human inability to initiate salvation. Denominations that were explicitly Arminian or embraced Arminian leanings, they grew significantly. Methodism, for one, founded by John Wesley, who was a staunch Arminian, became one of the largest and the most influential denominations in America, particularly through its effective use of revivals. While there are both Calvinistic, Reformed Baptists and Arminian Baptists, the more popular and rapidly growing branches of the Baptist tradition often lean towards Arminian views, especially concerning individual conversion and evangelism. And then we have to bring the holiness and the Pentecostal movements into this, which emerged in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, also having a strong Arminian theological foundation, emphasizing a person's choice to accept grace and pursue sanctification by law, by human works. And for many, particularly outside traditional Reformed circles, the doctrines of unconditional election, limited atonement, and so on and so forth, and Calvinism came to be perceived as harsh, unfair, even morally repugnant. Arminianism offered a more palatable alternative, emphasizing God's universal love and desire for all men to be saved. While Calvinism certainly still exists, the theological landscape of broad American Protestantism, it has for a long time been shaped predominantly by Arminian perspectives, especially in its emphasis on personal decision, evangelism, and the belief that salvation is genuinely offered to all who choose to accept it. Now, if you're a Calvinist, well, if you're an Arminian, you don't like this. I mean, if you're an Arminian, you love this stuff. You think, well, we put those Calvinists in their place. Their leaders, like John Winthrop and their ministers, were deeply committed to Reformed Calvinist theology. They actively opposed Arminianism, viewing it as a dangerous theological error that threatened their vision of a godly society. And now you know what went wrong with America from a religious standpoint. The roots of this theological corruption were not political, though that was a factor, but it was spiritual. When the Massachusetts Bay Colony assimilated Plymouth Colony, it was a merger of two Calvinist-dominated Puritan entities. And that merger solidified Calvinist influence in New England. It did not introduce Arminianism. Arminianism's foothold came later, and it came differently. The rise of Arminianism in America happened after the initial Puritan settlement era. These Arminian revival movements spread quickly across the prairie and then the new nation, often bypassing the established and largely Calvinist churches of New England. And the growth of Methodism, a denomination explicitly founded on Arminian principles by John Wesley, and certain branches of the Baptist movement were key drivers. These denominations did not emerge directly from the New England Puritan tradition, but they grew significantly in other parts of the colonies and the expanding frontier. The England spirit of Arminianism did come to the New World, but it didn't do so by following the Puritan separatists or by gaining a foothold through the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Instead, it arrived through other later streams of immigration and religious movements, and it flourished as a distinct alternative to the dominant Calvinism of early Puritan New England. The theological battles of the 17th century in England between Puritans, Calvinists, and the Arminian-leaning establishment were essentially refought and ultimately resolved differently in the American context over time, leading to the Arminianism that we see today in mainstream Protestant churches. If the separatist Pilgrim's vision had dominated and defined American Protestantism, a more doctrinally pure form of Christianity would be predominant today instead of Arminianism. If the separatist vision had been the defining mold for American Protestantism, the theological landscape would likely look very different. And it's entirely possible that a more explicitly Calvinist form of Protestantism would have prevailed. And we'd all be Calvinists for the most part. There had to be Arminians to minister to. Otherwise, we'd all be preaching to the choir. We had to be the minority. There had to be a walk of isolation, rejection, persecution. I mean, we had to share in Christ's sufferings. Romans chapter 8, verses 17 and 18. Now, if we are children, then we are heirs, heirs of God and co-heirs with Christ, if indeed we share in His sufferings, in order that we may also share in His glory. I consider that our present sufferings are not worthy to compare to the glory that will be revealed in us. And there had to be a falling away from the faith in the last days. So God knows what He's doing. I'm sure there are other reasons that I haven't thought of. However, whether that would have been a purer or a more enduring or widely adopted model in the long run is really debatable. The very strictness and exclusivity that defined the separatists' purity might have limited their ability to expand and adapt to the diverse and evolving American context, ultimately making a broader, more inclusive and often Arminian-leaning evangelicalism the more successful model for widespread adoption. The eventual prevalence of Arminianism suggests that the cultural and the social conditions of America ultimately favored a theology that emphasized individual choice and broader accessibility over strict theological and social conformity. Groups deeply committed to grace often promote an extremely high view of God's holiness, righteousness, sovereignty. They understand that only through God's grace can they ever hope to stand before such a holy God. This profound awareness of their own sinfulness and God's absolute purity can lead to a desire to live in a way that reflects His holiness. If salvation is truly by grace, and it is, the natural response of a grateful heart is to want to please God. Yet this desire to live righteously out of love and gratitude can sometimes subtly shift into an attempt to prove one's gratitude or prove one's election or to maintain one's standing. When grace is highly valued, there's often an intense concern that it not be abused or misunderstood. People worry about cheap grace, the idea that if salvation is free, one can live however one wants. To guard against this, boundaries, rules, behavioral codes are often established to demonstrate what true grace looks like in practice. And for groups like the Puritans, living under grace also meant striving to build a godly society, a visible community that reflected God's standards. To maintain the purity and distinctiveness of this community, strict moral codes and social norms became essential. Membership was often tied to demonstrating adherence to these codes, blurring the lines between genuine fruit of the Spirit and outward conformity. Even when consciously affirming grace alone, humans have a deep-seated tendency towards merit-seeking. It's often easier to measure one's spiritual standing by outward adherence to rules than by the invisible work of the Spirit and internal transformation. And this can lead to an unconscious or even conscious reliance on works to bolster assurance or to gain merit, gain favor with God. The Puritans are a prime historical example of this paradox. They were profoundly committed to salvation by grace through faith, yet they developed one of the most rigorous, legalistic societies in history with strict moral codes, Sabbath observance, and public display of piety. The intention was to live out their gratitude for grace and to build a holy commonwealth, but the practical outcome often involved a stringent enforcement of laws and norms that could feel oppressive or burdensome, sometimes even to those within the community. It is highly unlikely that any English Arminians intentionally migrated along with the Massachusetts Bay Puritans or the Plymouth Pilgrims. or that they were on board the ships as part of their core groups. In fact, the rise of Arminianism in England was a significant factor driving many Puritans and separatists to leave for the New World. You know, I guess it's possible a stranger, a non-separatist on the Mayflower, or someone on a later ship to Massachusetts Bay might have held some Arminian sympathies, but folks, they would have been a distinct minority, and certainly not part of the ruling class or the dominant religious groups. Their presence would have been tolerated only as long as they didn't openly challenge the established Puritan separatist religious order, which actively worked to exclude or suppress Arminian views. That got reversed. So it was for a fact Calvinists who established the first Christian colonies in America. But that purity could never be sustained through human governance. Human merit always creeps in. And you cannot legislate morality. The church was never commissioned to convert a religious system based on human merit. Terror will always grow among the wheat. We are in the world religious system, but we are not of it. John 17. And now come I to thee, and these things I speak in the world, that they might have my joy fulfilled in themselves. I have given them thy word, and the world hath hated them, because they are not of the world, even as I am not of the world. I pray not that thou shouldest take them out of the world, but that thou shouldest keep them from the evil. They are not of the world, even as I am not of the world. Sanctify them through thy truth. Thy word is truth. As thou hast sent me into the world, even so have I also sent them into the world. And for their sakes I sanctify myself, that they also might be sanctified through the truth. No, the grass was not greener on the other side of the ocean. They could leave England for the New World, but they couldn't leave the world. The Pilgrims and the Puritans sought to escape religious persecution and establish a society where they could practice their faith freely. They believed that the New World offered a blank slate, a chance to build a truly righteous community, a city upon a hill, untainted by the corruptions of the old world. However, they could not escape the fundamental challenges of the world itself. Despite their devout beliefs, they brought with them all the complexities of human nature: ambition, conflict, disease, the struggle for power, factions, disagreements, and just plain self emerged within their seemingly pure communities. The very act of governing and surviving tested their ideals. They often found themselves making pragmatic decisions that deviated from their initial utopian vision. While they found a different physical landscape and a new opportunity for religious freedom, they still had that old rotten sin nature. They couldn't leave that behind. They couldn't leave behind the inherent worldliness of humanity. And that is a powerful reminder that while our circumstances change, the flesh never will, no matter where we go. It is what we are being delivered from. And we look forward to a new body, like our Lord's, just as the Puritans did. Yeah, the Puritans, they held a profound and robust understanding of heaven, viewing it not merely as an afterlife, but as the ultimate culmination of God's redemptive plan and the supreme joy for believers. Their writings on heaven were rich with theological depth, practical application, and an emphasis on the glory of God. Puritan writings on heaven painted a picture of a dynamic, glorious, and Christ-exalting reality far exceeding anything imaginable on earth. And serving is the ultimate goal and comfort for the believing soul.